PATCON, the FBI's secret war against the Patriot movement, and how infiltration tactics relate to radicalizing influences, by J.M. Berger, May 2012. To coordinate a definite cause to a definite effect has sense only when both can be observed without introducing a foreign element disturbing their interrelation. Quote, Werner Heisenberg. He who fights with monsters should be careful, lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into the, quote, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Since September 11, 2001, more than 300 U.S. residents have been prosecuted for crimes related to homegrown terrorism. About half were targeted by law enforcement using infiltration techniques, confidential informants, undercover operations, or in some cases, both. The use of infiltration has grown increasingly controversial, particularly within the American Muslim community, where many view these techniques as bordering on entrapment, regardless of the legal definition. In the worst light, informants and undercover officers are seen as agents provocateurs, government employees who are instructed to provoke people into illegal acts so that they can be prosecuted. A 2011 Pew survey found that 52% of all American Muslims feel anti-terrorism policies in the United States single out Muslims for surveillance and monitoring. That number jumped to 71% among native-born American Muslims. 44% of the general public agreed with the assessment. That survey was taken before a series of investigative reports by the Associated Press on the New York Police Department's anti-terrorism unit confirmed some of the community's worst fears. The AP series, starting in August 2011, revealed that the NYPD has engaged in widespread surveillance of Muslim communities in New York, often without evidence of illegal activity, and often without producing actionable results. But questions about when and how to use infiltration techniques are not new and are not limited to Muslim communities in the post-9/11 era. Whether it's an undercover agent buying supplies for an al-Qaeda sympathizer, an FBI handler getting inappropriately close to a mob informant, or informants collecting evidence even as hackers compromise a private company's data, infiltration inherently involves unique risks along with it, potential rewards. Informants and undercover agents are essential tools for law enforcement officials, whether they are investigating terrorism, organized crime, corporate wrongdoing, computer hacking, or fraud. Infiltration methods have a proven track record as far as their legality and their investigative merits in the vast majority of cases. But methods that fall within legal bounds are not necessarily without negative consequences. Violent extremism presents a particularly devilish problem set in this respect. Law enforcement has an obvious stake in trying to determine whether nonviolent people who espouse extremist beliefs or engage in violent rhetoric might become violent. Now more than ever, the government is focused on preventing potential extremists from becoming violent. But infiltration techniques can have a dramatic effect on how targeted communities view efforts to counter and prevent violent extremism by raising questions about the government's intent and integrity. Aggressive infiltrations can even reinforce extremist narratives that claim the government targets communities because of their fundamental identities rather than in pursuit of illegal activities. The ripple effects of perceived overreach can also make it more difficult for otherwise friendly community partners to encourage cooperation with law enforcement. Studying the secondary effects of infiltration in current situations verges on the impossible for several reasons. The current activities of undercover agents and informants are closely guarded secrets for obvious reasons. When infiltrators are exposed in the course of an arrest and prosecution, descriptions of their activities are carefully controlled by prosecutors and carefully spun by defense attorneys, resulting in a distorted picture. Members of a targeted community may be reluctant to frankly discuss their attitudes toward these activities for fear of being targeted themselves. And finally, the secondary effects of infiltration can play out over years or even decades, rendering any short-term picture incomplete. Legacy cases, while still subject to many of the same pressures, offered an improved window on the details of specific infiltrations and on the medium and long-term effects on targeted communities. In the case of closed investigations, it is also possible to make a better evaluation of overt successes, such as arrests, prosecutions, and the prevention of violence and other planned activities. From 1991 to 1993, the FBI conducted an ambitious infiltration program code named PATCON, short for Patriot Conspiracy. Patriot is an umbrella label for a loosely defined movement of anti-government, racist, anti-Semitic, and/or Christian extremists. The PATCON program is documented in extraordinary detail in thousands of pages of FBI records obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, interviews with people involved on both sides of the infiltration supplement this information. PATCON consisted primarily of 3 FBI undercover agents posing as members of a fictional extremist group called the Veterans Aryan Movement. 3 Patriot groups were the primary targets of PATCON: Civilian Material Assistance, the Texas Light Infantry, and the American Pistol and Rifle Association. PATCON agents roved the country for more than 2 years collecting intelligence on these and other Patriot organizations and on dozens of individuals, investigating leads on plots from the planned murder of federal agents to armed raids on nuclear power plants to a new American revolution. Despite spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and logging uncounted man-hours, PATCON and related investigations produced negligible results in terms of serious criminal convictions. Instead, PATCON became an intelligence tool, predicated on a series of suspected crimes, most of which were discussed but never committed. Because it was not directly tied to a prosecution, the existence of PATCON was not formally disclosed until 2007, when references to the program appeared in documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests about the targeted groups. But the Patriot movement was keenly aware it had been infiltrated. Several people involved with targeted groups asserted in interviews after the fact that they were aware that at least one undercover agent involved with PATCON was a Fed. Whether or not that's true, the movement was actively worried about infiltration, and justifiably so. One group targeted by PATCON was described by the FBI as extremely sensitive to investigative pressure. Another group deliberately discussed exotic threats in order to provoke the FBI into overreacting and to surface informants. The paranoia that resulted from the awareness of infiltration led to some members being expelled or ostracized on the often incorrect suspicion that they were informants. Patriot gatherings were at times disrupted and even canceled over concerns about infiltration by federal investigators. One former informant interviewed for this report said he believed the FBI was just fine with that outcome, but added that such mind games often reinforced the radical beliefs of those being monitored. "I think they played a lot of people against each other," he said. "The guys hated them more and more for it. They thought Big Brother was moving in on them." In addition to the murky complexities of the observer effect, in which the act of observing something causes changes in the subject of observation, the PATCON investigation highlights several critical issues surrounding the use of infiltration. Reinforcing grievances. As with many other radical movements, Patriot ideology revolves around a belief that the U.S. government is fundamentally at war with its values, which vary by group but often include gun rights, white nationalism, anti-gay sentiments, and/or abortion prohibition. In interviews for this report and in ideological tracks, patriots frequently pointed to the use of infiltrators, often characterized as agents provocateurs, as a key grievance and operational concern. An example can be found in Patriot Ideologue, Louis Beam's infamous tract on leaderless resistance, a strategy that is predicated on the threat of infiltration. The idea of a war footing is strongly reinforced by violent confrontations such as Ruby Ridge, which was sparked by a conflict over infiltration, and Waco, which had specific relevance to some of the PATCON targeted groups, intelligence versus prosecution. Much has been written about the conflict between the roles of the FBI as an intelligence-gathering operation and as a criminal investigation unit. FBI rules stipulate that full field investigations, such as PATCON, must be predicated on specific suspected crimes, a requirement heightened in investigations of domestic extremism, where First Amendment issues come into play. In dealing with headquarters, PATCON supervisors had to continually justify the operation by finding intelligence related to crimes past, present, or future. By pointing to specific and theoretically prosecutable crimes, PATCON supervisors were also able to secure dramatically improved funding for the operation. Throughout PATCON's history, the nominal justification for the operation shifted several times, and the investigation strayed far from its stated pretexts, continually expanding to encompass additional targets of opportunity. There was a vested interest in continuing a successful undercover operation once begun. FBI field offices and programs are evaluated on a statistical basis. The use of extraordinary investigative techniques, such as wiretaps and undercover operations, is factored in as a measure of good work, value of intelligence gathered. It's unclear what value the collected intelligence held in the final analysis. The only PATCON targets ever prosecuted were already under investigation by the Army's Criminal Investigative Division, and none of the specific terrorist plots alleged in the FBI's records ever came to fruition. Agents involved with PATCON and related investigations said that the collection of intelligence on Patriot leaders had value in itself and helped elevate a top echelon informant within the white supremacist group Aryan Nations, but conceded that many of the investigation's targets turned out to be all talk. Meanwhile, Timothy McVeigh literally drove through the middle of PATCON's investigative landscape without attracting notice. McVeigh interacted with members and associates of the targeted groups, but there is no evidence that the intelligence collected by PATCON ever came into play during the investigation of the 1995 Oklahoma City federal building bombing. While there is obvious value in collecting information about extremist activity, it must be weighed against fiscal and social costs incurred, as well as the constitutional implications of targeting groups with strong political or religious component. Interagency conflict. One of the investigations carried out by PATCON involved the theft of night vision goggles from Fort Hood in Texas, which was also the subject of an Army criminal investigation. To preserve the undercover operation, the FBI delayed sharing information with the Army's team, which subsequently launched its own undercover operation against some of the same targets. PATCON's direct contribution to the ultimate prosecution was negligible, but the episode illustrates the challenges of coordinating undercover operations when bureaucratic jurisdiction is not clear. Civil liberties. Much of the focus of PATCON was on speech, whether public or private. The undercover agents and informants attended conventions and gatherings, reporting on who participated and what was said. They also reported private conversations about alleged terrorist plots that typically went nowhere. You have talkers and doers out there, and 99% of the people are talkers, said a former Patriot informant, most of the targets of PATCON, even those engaged in frighteningly violent rhetoric, never transitioned from talk to action. The FBI's records of the program suggest that it was not always clear when the investigative imperative should have given way to First Amendment concerns. In at least one instance, a carefully worded speech was described incorrectly by a PATCON undercover agent as containing an explicit call to violence. It is unclear whether the speech was misheard or misconstrued. Ultimately, however, PATCON was based on threat reports that clearly merited scrutiny. In the case study that follows, which relies heavily on the FBI's perspective, it is easy to see how each individual lead would prompt investigation. Most of the threats examined by PATCON were aspirational at best, but how could FBI agents know that without investigating? The narrative below illustrates this dilemma. This report describes PATCON in detail from its origins, through its conclusion and profiles, the three groups targeted in the investigation. The report examines Timothy McVeigh's contacts with the Patriot movement, including several people linked to the groups targeted by PATCON. It concludes with a look at how infiltration broadly influences Patriot thought and with recommendations for further study. The story of PATCON highlights issues that are relevant to the challenges of today, particularly regarding the New York Police Department's wide-ranging intelligence collection targeting Muslim communities. There are fundamental differences between targeting the radical fringe patriot movement and targeting the mainstream Muslim community. Targeting all Muslims for infiltration is akin to targeting all white Americans in order to gain intelligence on white supremacists. The social consequences of fomenting paranoia and mistrust of government in overwhelmingly law-abiding communities are different from those that stem from infiltrating a movement that fundamentally presumes government malfeasance. This report is intended as a first step to broaden the national policy discussion about infiltration techniques and their effects on targeted communities. On the road, as Timothy McVeigh drove away from Buffalo at the start of 1993, the trappings of an ordinary life receded in the rearview mirror, abandoned like the region's steel mills. There would be no regular jobs, no daily commute, no fixed address, no wife and family. Whatever normality the 24-year-old had known in his life was behind him. Born into a family that broke in divorce when he was 10, McVeigh struggled to find his place growing up in Lockport, an outer suburb of Buffalo. As a teenager, he was drawn to guns and survivalism, tinged with an incipient racism he tried to deny. McVeigh joined the Army in 1988 and served through the Persian Gulf War in 1991. He was an expert marksman but had difficulty dealing with black soldiers in his unit. He applied to join the Special Forces but was rejected after he failed to meet the rigorous physical requirements. Some months later, he left the Army and moved home to Lockport, immersing himself ever deeper in the world of patriot extremism. The Patriot movement consisted of small, localized organizations that defined themselves under a loosely unified banner despite wildly differing ideologies. For instance, some justified white racism using distorted Christian teachings, while others embraced Odinism, a warped version of Norse mythology. Others focused on elaborate constitutional fantasies. Evidence of McVeigh's early attraction to extremism can be found in the book that he tried to share with almost everyone he met, The Turner Diaries, a 1978 novel by infamous white nationalist William Pierce. McVeigh first encountered the book in 1988, around the time he enlisted in the Army. He kept it with him throughout his service and kept sharing it with others, despite reprimands from his superiors. By the time he left Buffalo, McVeigh was selling the book at gun shows. Set in the near future, The Turner Diaries describes a white insurrection against the United States government culminating in a global racial holocaust. Although McVeigh would later tell biographers he was attracted mainly to the book's anti-government message, it is extraordinarily unlikely that The Turner Diaries could appeal to anyone who is not a hardened racist. Dripping with racial animus, The Turner Diaries does not aim to convince readers of the virtues of white supremacy. Rather, it assumes bigotry on the part of readers and explicitly tries to move them from passive agreement to violent extremism. Aside from its ideological contribution to the literature of white supremacy, The Turner Diaries introduced the concept of a secret cabal promoting a white-only agenda, known simply as the Order. The fictional order is vaguely described except for its initiation ritual and its role as the ideological and strategic leadership of the insurrection. But this skeletal outline was enough to inspire real-world imitators who were engaged in a covert war with the federal government. When McVeigh left home, he was heading toward the front line of that war, and an intersection with an incarnate version of the hateful fantasy that had so captured his imagination. The real world order, like its fictional counterpart, was locked in battle with the U.S. government, a conflict that would soon explode in fiery cataclysm at a rural compound outside of Waco, Texas. One of the clearest examples of the power of the idea behind the order was a white supremacist group known as the Veterans Aryan Movement, a group of former soldiers based in Texas. Known in the movement to raise money through armored car robberies and bank heists, the militia invested its ample war chest in the purchase of arms and equipment for the coming revolution and traveled the country to consult and coordinate with other groups that shared the same agenda. But the Veterans Aryan Movement had a secret, one it successfully concealed from even its closest allies. The organization was an invention of the FBI, and every member of the group was an undercover FBI agent. The operation's code name was PATCON, short for Patriot Conspiracy, and it would soon reach across the country an expansive search for information on anti-government and racist organizations that the FBI believed were seeking to join forces to overthrow the government. Section civilian material assistance. McVeigh's first stop was in Plantation, Florida, just west of Fort Lauderdale, where his sister Patricia lived with her family. He arrived in February 1993 and soon set up shop at a gun show at the Fort Lauderdale Armory. McVeigh had begun regularly attending shows as a buyer before he left the Army in 1991. In this new phase of his life, he would become a seller. Dressed in his Desert Storm fatigues and polished boots, he offered shirts, canteens, duffels, sleeping bags, and copies of the Turner Diaries. McVeigh drew the notice of another seller at the show, a man named Roger Moore, who bought a few items from the Gulf War veteran and struck up a conversation. Colorful was too pale a word to describe Moore. The owner of a mail-order ammunition company known as the Candy Store, Moore traveled to gun shows around the country using his own name and a number of aliases. Bob Miller, Colonel Bob Anderson, Bob from Arkansas, and simply Arkansas Bob. Moore had a girlfriend, Karen Anderson, who lived on a ranch he owned in Arkansas and sometimes attended shows with him. He also had a wife, Carol, living in Florida, whom he sometimes introduced as his sister. Moore's professional life was as curious as his personal life. He described himself as a self-made millionaire who had enough money to retire, but Moore found ways to keep busy. The Candy Store gave him an excuse to travel around the country and hang out at gun shows. It also facilitated contact with the Patriot movement. Under his alias of Bob Miller, Moore had been involved for years with a Patriot organization called Civilian Material Assistance, CMA, which organized volunteer efforts against communism during the 1980s. A former Marine named Thomas Posey had created the anti-communist militia. Starting in September 1983, Posey began shuttling shipments of clothing and food from Alabama to Central America to assist the Contras in their insurgent struggle against the leftist regime in Nicaragua. Some former members of the organization said the aid was primarily humanitarian. Others insisted there was more to the story. An aide to Oliver North, a Marine lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council staff, offered the CMA some direction. And the group had contact with others in the U.S. government, a series of rumored connections to military intelligence and Central Intelligence Agency officials that has never become clear. A civil lawsuit over the group's alleged illegal activities ended with a $1 million judgment in favor of the CMA and other defendants for attorney fees and costs. But congressional pressure and the glare of publicity forced an end to the covert pipeline to the Contras. CMA's members had other interests that kept them in touch. Posey proposed forming a political party so pro-American and patriotic that it's going to be hard for anyone to vote against us. The idea went nowhere. Later, CMA members began arresting suspected illegal immigrants on the Arizona-Mexico border, but law enforcement quickly prohibited such activities. After the Iran-Contra program was exposed to the public and closed down amid a congressional investigation, Posey reconfigured the CMA as a survivalist-type group opposed to the U.S. government and aimed to make friends with a constellation of white supremacist and survivalist organizations across the country. This extremist reincarnation of CMA boasted approximately 700 active members, with new blood regularly recruited at an annual convention hosted by Soldier of Fortune magazine in Las Vegas. Roger Moore attended the convention regularly, renting a table to sell ammunition and spending most of his time with Posey and other CMA members. At the 1990 convention, CMA cadres met leaders of a militia group known as the Texas Light Infantry, and the two groups would soon join forces to create an alliance that would reach across the country and expose itself to FBI infiltration. The Texas Light Infantry, TLI, formed during the 1980s with the stated goal of serving as a volunteer force during emergencies. It maintained quote-unquote battalions in different parts of the state, including Houston and Austin. Members took part in exercises roughly akin to infantry training, with occasional ventures into more exotic activities such as parachute jumping. Around 1990, some TLI members began branching out into, quote, paramilitary survivalist, unquote, activities, according to FBI documents, crafting ties with the Aryan nations and, quote, persons throughout the U.S. involved in the white supremacy movement, unquote. Former members and associates disputed this claim as it applied to the official organization. The leaders of the TLI were extremely concerned about the political image and absolutely forbade any political or racial rhetoric. TLI functions, said Dave Holloway, a member of the group from the 1980s through 1991. There may have been people with uncharitable attitudes towards other races, but expressing such sentiments was something actively discouraged in the TLI, said a second former TLI member who asked not to be named. The TLI had at least one black member and several Latino members, according to multiple sources, but several members of the group were embroiled in racial politics in one way or another. When Holloway left TLI, he moved to North Carolina and began working for the Cause Foundation, which made its name providing legal assistance in racially charged cases, often, but not always, on behalf of whites. Another prominent TLI member had family ties to the Aryan nations. The FBI's interest in specific TLI members was primarily motivated by their association with Louis Beam, an infamous radical ideologue living in Austin, and by reports that some members of the group were referring to it internally as the Order. The Order, first described in the Turner Diaries, had emerged into the real world, after a fashion, during the early 1980s. Robert J. Matthews, a right-wing extremist who began as a strident anti-communist and went on into organized racism, gathered at least a dozen men from around the country to take on the fictional organization's mission. In the Turner Diaries, extremists directed by the Order are forced to commit petty crimes in order to fund their insurrection. Matthews and his followers took on the name and followed the plot point, carrying out 2 bank robberies and 3 armored car robberies, the proceeds of which were intended to fund a racist revolution to overthrow the U.S. government. At least 2 people were murdered by the group. In late 1984, federal agents shut down the Order, killing Matthews in the course of trying to arrest him. Several members were prosecuted and convicted under federal racketeering laws. Others were arrested in 1987 and tried under rarely used sedition laws. The case collapsed, resulting in the acquittal of all defendants. Among those acquitted in the sedition trial was Beam, an influential racist, prominent in the Ku Klux Klan and Aryan nations. After the trial, Beam returned to his native Texas, where he published a newsletter mockingly titled The Seditionist, crafting ties with the Aryan nations in Idaho and spending time with friends in the TLI, although he was not an official member. Beam did not respond to an email requesting an interview. Radical rhetoric and racial views were not sufficient reason to open a formal FBI investigation. But more aggressive steps were taken when, according to an informant, some within the TLI began discussing specific threats to kill 2 FBI agents in revenge for an earlier arrest, details of which are redacted from FBI documents. The Bureau conducted surreptitious searches, hauled TLI members in for interviews, deployed undercover agents, and at one point had 4 informants inside the group at the same time. The incoming intelligence only amplified the FBI's concern. The FBI believed members of the TLI were stockpiling explosives for use against the government, such as a proposed mortar attack on an FBI office. The organization was alleged to have at least 1 local law enforcement officer in its pocket. Skinheads and racist extremists from around Texas joined TLI members in the Austin area for paramilitary training on a regular basis, informants asserted. In June 1990, the FBI searched the grounds of a TLI training camp near Austin and found the remains of 2 sophisticated pipe bombs. In early 1991, the group became aware of the FBI's interest in the camp and tore up stakes, relocating to a site about 2 hours away. The TLI even sent an operative to the FBI's Austin office on a fishing expedition, posing as a walk, an informant to try to find out what the FBI already knew about the group. The effort failed, but TLI's more militant members continued to probe for infiltrators. Their concern was justified. Paranoid times. From its genesis at the Soldier of Fortune convention in 1990, the proposed alliance between CMA and TLI's extremist clique was dogged by suspected and actual government infiltration. Concerns came to a head in November 1991, when CMI hosted a convention in Posey's hometown of Decatur, Alabama, inviting representatives from a number of different patriot groups. Members of the Texas Light Infantry were there, along with representatives of the American Pistol and Rifle Association, an organization based in Tennessee. CMI and the TLI, or at least its more extreme members, had already joined forces. Persons holding ranks in the TLI have equivalent rank in the CMA, an FBI memorandum noted. TLI members and associates interviewed for this report denied knowledge of any alliance with CMA. The primary item on the convention's agenda was extending Posey's agenda to create a nationwide coalition strong enough to stand up to the full might of the federal government, but flexible enough to include often wildly divergent ideologies. According to FBI records, the strategy called for interlocking anti-government groups so that the movement could be ready to fight the government when the government attempts to take over the rights of the citizens, similar to the scenario described in the Turner Diaries. Interlocking would connect extremist groups by making members of one group members of another group in order to increase communication and cooperation so they could unite to violently oppose the government. This interlocking procedure allows groups with different viewpoints, but with the same common anti-government beliefs to join together, an informant reported. The groups would maintain their own names and identities, but would be expected to coordinate when the time came for a revolution. But there were obstacles. Paranoia was rampant during the convention. One attendee asked too many questions, leading to suspicion he was a government agent. Other convention goers became convinced the FBI had electronic surveillance in place. A scramble to increase security led to a wild search of the hotel where the convention was taking place. The searchers discovered a surveillance unit put in place by the local sheriff's office and nearly caught someone else working the event. The actual FBI informants went undiscovered. One later described the scene as pandemonium in a report back to the Bureau and said many attendees left over concerns about infiltration. The convention may be over at this point. One informant reported, "It might have been, but the FBI's interest in the proposed alliance was only beginning." PATCON. Initial information on the Texas Light Infantry came from a longtime FBI informant named Vince Reed, a Vietnam vet whose injuries frustrated his desire to work as a law enforcement officer. Reed worked instead for the FBI as a source, informing on the Hells Angels. He relocated to Texas, where he began providing agents with information on the associates of Louis Beam, whose ties to the Aryan nations were a top priority for Texas FBI agents. An undercover agent posed as Reed's gun dealer in order to strengthen his cover. But agents in the FBI's Austin resident agency felt Reed could go further with more support. In April 1991, FBI headquarters gave the San Antonio field office its blessing to launch the PATCON Group I undercover operation in support of Reed's efforts. Group I undercover operations are better funded and more ambitious than routine undercover investigations and are reserved for special circumstances in which a specific potential crime is suspected. On paper, the predicate for PATCON was the verbal threat against two Austin-based FBI agents who answered to the San Antonio field office. But in practice, its goals were strengthening Reed's cover by showing he had useful allies and collecting information about rumored efforts to recreate the order, the proposed alliance of anti-government groups, and the Patriot movement as a whole. PATCON was built around three undercover agents who posed as members of an invented racist militia group called the Veterans Aryan Movement, VAM, led by an agent using the name Dave Rossi. Reed and the agents were set up with a safe house in the Austin area, wired for sound and video, where they tried, largely without success, to engage Beam's friends in the TLI in recorded conversations about criminal activity. The agent posing as Rossi was an experienced undercover operative who had previously worked on narcotics cases. He was a student of the white supremacist movement and a military veteran who had served in Vietnam, which was an advantage for infiltrating the veteran heavy patriot movement. Within the movement, Rossi explained that the VAM was following the order's blueprint, conducting armored car robberies to fund future terrorist activities. The story was readily accepted, especially as it became clear Rossi had money and was not shy about spending it. The similarities between the VAM and the order were also appreciated on an ideological level. The old order, led by Robert Matthews, tried to do it all themselves, said one TLI-connected person in a meeting with Rossi, as documented by the FBI. We need to form units throughout the United States. The seed was planted by the order. We must make it grow. We must make it grow. Around the time PATCON was launched, the FBI promoted a source within CMA to full-time paid informant status. Reed, as well, was given wide latitude to pursue contacts with TLI associates, at times wearing a wire. Within weeks of PATCON's launch, its mandate started to shift away from the alleged threat to FBI personnel. A June 1991 FBI memorandum outlined PATCON's goals as continued infiltration of the TLI, also known as the Texas Reserve Militia, also known as the Order, and surveillance and interviews of TLI members with an eye toward prosecution for conspiracy to commit murder, illegal possession of weapons and explosives, money laundering, etc. By November, an FBI headquarters review of PATCON found that the threat against the agents that justified the undercover operation was not as imminent as originally feared and had been referenced only in vague fashion since the original report. Initial investigation revealed that TLI associates had conducted surveillance on at least one of the Austin agents, who was also overseeing PATCON, including monitoring his home and identifying the times he went jogging. But when informants and other undercover agents were deployed to test the seriousness of the plan, the TLI associates said no action would be taken until after the Patriot movement had overthrown the U.S. government. The agent who had been the subject of surveillance was eventually removed from handling PATCON due to the conflict of interest created by investigating people who had targeted him. Despite all this, the review concluded that PATCON was well-focused and said it had not expanded beyond the intent of the authorization. But the operation was about to expand dramatically. PATCON would serve as a vehicle to collect evidence of the criminal activity of suspected domestic terrorism organizations such as the Order, an FBI memorandum explained. The PATCON investigation would quickly cross state and organizational lines. As for Vince Reed, his contacts with TLI associates in Texas led to introductions at the highest levels of the Aryan nations in Hayden Lake, Idaho, where he relocated in 1992. While constantly feeding information back to his handlers at the FBI, Reed went on to become ambassador at large for the Aryan nations with authority to speak for its leader, Richard Butler, a distinction enjoyed by only one other member of the group, Louis Beam. Stinger missiles, the intelligence flowing out of the FBI's Patriot infiltrations, if accurate, was alarming. The aligned groups claimed to represent thousands of members with some degree of financing and military experience who were training and stockpiling armories for a revolution against the U.S. government, similar to the grandiose ambitions outlined in the Turner Diaries. In late February 1992, a source reported to the FBI field office in Birmingham, Alabama, that CMA leader Tom Posey was trying to sell 4 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles on the black market, purportedly on behalf of a friend. A TLI member targeted by PATCON vouched for the veterans' Aryan movement to Posey a few weeks later, resulting in a phone call to Posey on May 6, 1992. We have a mutual friend in Austin who gave me your number and suggested I call you to discuss things of mutual interest, Rossi said. They scheduled a face-to-face meeting in June, including the TLI member, Posey, and another CMA member, Rossi, and a second PATCON agent. The depth of the FBI's penetration of the movement was illustrated by the fact that the man Posey brought to watch his back was also a paid FBI informant. Posey picked up the agents at the airport in Birmingham. On the way back to his house, they drove past the FBI's Birmingham field office. Posey pointed out the window. "We're going to make FBI agents an endangered species," he said. Throughout the drive, Posey noted infrastructure highlights such as bridges, railroad tracks, towers, and fuel pipelines, commenting on how easy each would be to destroy. After an overnight visit, in which the men discussed the movement and plans for the revolution, Posey drove the undercover agents back to the airport. During the drive, one of them told Posey that VAM was interested in sexy equipment for some of its operation. "How about stingers?" Posey responded immediately. CMA member could provide 5 stingers for $40,000 each, but the price might be negotiable. They agreed to use the word catfish as code for the missiles in follow-up conversations by phone. The negotiations over the stingers would drag on for months, but the Veterans Aryan movement did not sit idle. As the visitors neared the airport, Posey mentioned that he would be attending the Aryan Nations World Congress in Idaho in July, and Chalayan suggested that Rossi and his colleagues should come along. The FBI's invented militia was pushing deeper into the shadowy world of right-wing militancy, moving ever further from its original mandate to investigate threats to the 2 FBI agents in Texas. The specificity of the threat has decreased, an FBI memorandum on the investigation noted. However, any time the subject of the FBI comes up in a conversation, references are made by name to the 2 threatened FBI agents, and veiled threats are once again voiced. To justify the extra funding and resources of a Group I undercover operation, supervising agents are required to file a status report every 180 days describing the investigation to date and the suspected criminal acts on which it is predicated. Each memorandum on PATCON and the Texas Light Infantry cited the threat against the agents as a predicate for investigating, usually before any other reason. But virtually all of PATCON's investigative activity was directed toward intelligence gathering and an ever-changing list of other suspected crimes. The threat had opened a small door for investigation, and the FBI was driving a tractor-trailer through the opening. World Tour of Extremism. The FBI increasingly treated the PATCON undercover operation as a multi-purpose tool to penetrate the Patriot movement and collect intelligence, sometimes without any prospect for an indictment. The Aryan Nations World Congress presented an irresistible opportunity. The official purpose for sending the agents to the World Congress was to get Posey on tape discussing the Stinger deal to help counter any later claims of entrapment, according to an FBI communication. But the interests of the undercover operation were not restricted to the Stinger investigation. PATCON was essential to the successful identification of new domestic terrorism organizations, an FBI memorandum stated. The World Congress was an annual meeting of white supremacists and assorted other patriots at Hayden Lake, Idaho, where the Aryan Nations maintained its headquarters. About 75 people attended the 1992 Congress from several states and Canada. Rossi and another PATCON agent worked the grounds, dropping the names of TLI members to bolster their credibility. Speeches were dutifully noted by the agents. One speaker told audience members that they should be stockpiling food and weapons for the day that the government would come to take their guns, as stated in the Turner Diaries. This would be a familiar theme throughout most of the speeches, according to an FBI memorandum. A great deal of unpleasant talk was reported, but no crimes were on display. The PATCON Road Show also took Rossi to Benton, Tennessee in mid-1992 to meet with John L. Grady, a doctor and an outspoken opponent of abortion. Grady was head of a dues-paying organization called the American Pistol and Rifle Association, based at his Benton compound, which included a church, a firing range, and a handful of additional buildings, including a residence. From the same location, Grady led the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, or simply the Order of St. John, a fraternal organization with a prophetic mission that claimed to trace its roots to a Roman Catholic religious order from the Middle Ages. The OSJ was described as an invitation-only sect with branches around the country. An informant reported that Grady claimed to have been a founding member of the order with a close relationship to Robert Matthews. In turn, several members of the order had been members of ARPA. In a 2012 interview, Grady denied being a member of the order. ARPA had been represented at the CMA's disastrous Decatur convention, where a speaker affiliated with Grady's group explained that its function was to train white supremacists and paramilitary groups on defensive tactics and how to shoot police officers before they can shoot you, according to informants. The FBI believed Grady subsequently hosted meetings in Benton to discuss the proposed interlocking of patriot groups broached at the convention. In meetings between Grady and CMA members earlier in 1992, discussions were held about creating six-man terrorist cells that would carry out acts of violence, including attacks on microwave, radio, telephone, electric, and TV towers, and then nuclear power plants. FBI report said assassinations would be carried out against congressional leaders, Jewish leaders, and neighborhood leaders of black gangs. In the encounter with Rossi, Grady explained that he had been trying to create the Patriot Alliance for 25 years, according to an FBI record of the meeting. Grady said the American Pistol and Rifle Association had units all over the country that should be prepared to take over small post offices and do acts of violence such as blowing up microwave towers. Each group was supposed to create its own plan of action, but no specific plans were set into motion during the encounter. Instead, the FBI report said, Grady warned Rossi that a takeover of the government couldn't be done because the American public was too complacent, lazy, and undisciplined. Excerpts from several FBI documents containing these allegations were mailed to Grady, who responded in a telephone interview. Every statement that you've shown me is false, Grady said. He disputed the contention in FBI documents that the Order of St. John and the ARPA were linked except by virtue of his role in each, and denied that the groups were white supremacist in nature and that they were aligned with CMA. We had nothing to do with Posey. I hardly knew his name, Grady said, discounting assertions that CMA and ARPA worked together. He said he was aware of Posey as a good patriotic man, but that's as far as that went. According to the FBI records, Grady told Rossi to join the ARPA and asked if he was coming to the organization's convention in September. While welcoming, Grady was also wary. According to the records, he explained to Rossi that agents and informants should be dealt with, eliminated, that this was the way to deal with them and discourage their attempts at infiltration of the movement. According to an FBI account of the conversation, those comments were directly sparked by discussion of a violent standoff in remote Ruby Ridge, Idaho. What the Patriots didn't know was that a member of the Veterans Aryan movement had been involved in Ruby Ridge on the side of the government.